Hello, I'm Robert Estrin. Some of you may know me from my videos, livingpianos.com and YouTube. You know, I get to connect with people who have a passion for the handmade American and European pianos that I grew up with. You see, my family are all musicians. I studied with my father, Estrin, who's a concert pianist. My sister is a pianist as well. And I also got to study with some phenomenal concert pianists at the Manhattan School of Music, Indiana University, as well as the Mozarteum in Salzburg, Austria. So I've been surrounded with great pianists and pianos my entire life. Now here we are, and my wife and I are both musicians, and we have concerts right here in our live-work loft. And downstairs I've got all sorts of wonderful pianos. Here we perform many different concerts, including my Living Piano Historic Concert Experience with youngsters, prodigies I work with, and we perform workshops and all sorts of performances all over the region. You know, there are lots of piano stores out there, and the fact is, if you're looking for a high quality Asian production piano, you can go to countless stores throughout the country. But the number of American-made pianos has dwindled down to a tiny handful. And I've grown up with these pianos. I remember helping my father choose pianos for his New York recitals and recordings. And these instruments are quite rare today. The benefit of owning a handmade American or European top-tier piano is the fact that these instruments can last generations. More than that, since there's a limited number of them and the price of new pianos is so expensive with these handmade instruments, it pays to restore them. And you can enjoy a higher level of sound and touch on these instruments. I want you to consider me as a personal resource for any piano questions you may have, whether it's about pianos or about piano playing. And many of your questions will end up in future videos for other people to enjoy. If you have a piano and you're wondering if it's worth selling or restoring, feel free to contact me anytime. So, thanks for joining me here. This is just an introduction. If you'd like more information, feel free to visit me on the website or feel free to contact me personally, Robert Estrin at livingpianos.com. Welcome to livingpianos.com live clinic on piano technique for you. We're going to attempt today to answer all your questions personally, or as many as we can get to, involving piano technique, which is a vast subject. I encourage you to type in questions and we will address them here for you. First though, I'm going to, before we even discuss the whole topic of piano technique, because that you can write books about and have complete courses on, obviously. People study piano for years and years developing technique, and we're going to talk about what that all means. First, while you get your questions together, I'm going to address a couple of questions that came in during this week. One from Jerome. I've been wondering, how do blind pianists learn a new piece by themselves if they don't play by ear? Is there some sort of sheet music equivalent for blind people? This is an excellent question, and the simple answer is yes, there is Braille for blind musicians. However, it is a very, very tiny microcosm of the amount of music that is printed. So many blind pianists indeed do depend upon learning by ear or have some coach to help them through. It's an arduous task. There is a fabulous documentary I'm not going to tell you anything about, but I encourage all of you to watch, Surprise in Texas. And it is an enlightening video that relates to this subject, all right? So yes, it takes not only having some Braille sheet music, but learning music that is written more recently or is not published. You need some people to help you out with that. Great question, but thank goodness there is Braille. There's a whole society that adds to the library all the time. We have another question here, this one from Luria. I found a professional piano teacher who is still holding concerts, playing at events, and teaching children and adults. However, he uses an 88-key keyboard to teach at his house, but we have an upright piano at our home. We already had 2 lessons with him, and my 2 boys like him. I'm a bit concerned that he doesn't use a piano to teach, bearing in mind that my boys are already in the advanced stages. grade 7 and grade 6. Should I consider changing to a teacher with a proper piano to teach, or is that okay, teaching with a keyboard but practicing on a piano? Well, there's many ramifications to the answering this question, because one of the great challenges being a pianist or a piano student is the fact that you have to adjust to any piano you find. So you practice all week long, whatever you practice on. Lessons, let's say, for example, you practice all week long on an upright, then lessons are on a grand piano, recitals are on a concert grand piano, and no two pianos feel the same. The pedals operate quite differently from one another. That is, how far it takes to push them to engage, all sorts of things. So everybody has to adjust. Now, when you say the teacher has an 88-note keyboard, it's possible that what the teacher is teaching on is a digital piano. Now, they may seem like the same thing, but there are fundamental differences between a digital piano and a keyboard. And that is the action. Digital pianos have what's referred to as a weighted and oftentimes graded action. So the weight will mimic that of a concert grand piano. Now, what does grading mean? You may hear this term, and is it important? Personally, I don't think it's vital, but it does get you a little bit closer to the feel of a traditional piano in that if you play a grand piano or even an upright piano, the hammers in the bass section are bigger and heavier than those on the treble section. The keys are even longer in the bass to reach further into the strings. So you have a more substantial feel with more weight required to play the notes in the bass than on the treble. Did you ever notice that? Well, many digital pianos not only have a weighted action, but they're even graded so that the low notes are heavier, just like they are on an acoustic piano. So it may not be a problem if it's a good, high-quality digital piano. Perhaps the teacher teaches in a studio separate from their home where they have a grand piano. If you can find a teacher who has a really nice piano, that's a double bonus if you have a great teacher and the students get to play on a really fine instrument. It's a learning experience just being able to play on a concert grand, for example. So there's many things to consider. Before now, I start addressing all your questions here, which I see they're coming in, which I'm very, very grateful for, by the way. I want to mention and talk about a little bit, what is piano technique? And I said, of course, it's a vast subject. There's many things involved, and the obvious thing is playing fast, playing loud, playing trills, playing hard music. But there's much more to it than that. For example, being able to control tone on the piano. And I'm not just talking about the sound of one note, which is neither here nor there on the piano for the most part, but the continuity of line, or even more so, the lines that you have in your playing. For example, if you're playing Bach and you have writing that is counterpoint, like a fugue where you have different lines, delineating each separate line takes an amazing amount of technique that you wouldn't think of in an obvious way, like in this second movement of Bach's Toccata in E minor. Now, even if it's not counterpoint, that is multiple separate lines, just having music that has different lines that have to be played at different volume levels. For example, the second movement of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, in which you want the treble and the bass to come out clearly, particularly the treble, the melody, and you want the inner notes to be very delicate. This takes a real control that I classify as an essential part of piano technique. So listen to a little bit of Beethoven in this regard and notice how the inner lines are much quieter than the top line and even the bass line. Now, if you were to hear a beginning pianist play this is not particularly complex music, but you would hear a vast difference in the sound created because it takes tremendous control just being able to play one hand louder than the other hand on the piano, much less notes within one hand to follow through on the top line while keeping the bottom line delicate. And I've talked about that technique before. Some of you may have watched my videos on that subject, how playing with different articulations, different phrasing on different lines enables you to learn in your hand where the melody notes are. So playing this, for example, the right hand, that's one great technique for practicing independence of lines. So there's many aspects to technique, and there are some macro ways of addressing developing your technique. Number one, any pianist, and I would go so far as to say any musician who's serious about developing their technique, has got a metronome at their disposal all the time. Why? Because none of us has perfect clocks within us. More than that, we have a natural tendency to compensate for places that are hard, and we might tend to slow down just to get through it. Then, when you work hard, you might overcompensate, not even realizing you're actually speeding up those hard sections. So having a metronome, and of course, mastering all your major and minor scales and arpeggios by practicing slowly and building up. Great technique. So let's get to some questions here. Major and Minor asks, how do you bring out multiple voices on the piano? Boy, I must have read your mind. So this is the secret. Playing with different articulations, different phrasing within different lines of music is a great way to be able to differentiate. And you can, by the way, in counterpoint where you have many different lines that are of equal importance, like in a fugue, for example, you can, each time you play a section of a piece, you can bring out different lines. Interesting. So I'm trying to think of an example, even of, for example, if you were to play the second movement of Beethoven Pastoral Sonata. Now, here it's once again obvious that you would want the top line to project. And of course you could practice that the way I described before, playing the melody, the line you want to bring out, legato, and the rest staccato. I'm going to leave out the left hand because that's all staccato. But what if you wanted to practice it with the tenor line, the bottom line of the right hand? And you can go through and do the inner line that way as well. So this is a phenomenal way to develop the independence of lines, because quantifying loud and soft is not as much of a determination as staccato and legato, where you can hear it and feel it, and train your hand for each individual line in counterpoint. Great question. I'm so glad you asked that, because that's what I thought of starting with. So now we have another question by Zacchaeus. Does taking a break at the piano reduce your ability to play more virtuosic pieces? I would think exactly the opposite. As a matter of fact, taking breaks from your practice is a way that you can absorb what you've done, and more than that, avoid injury. When I'm practicing particularly intense music that is very taxing physically, I will purposely shift to some other music or take a walk, take a 15, 20-minute walk, and you'll be surprised at how just getting yourself away from it, coming back fresh, sometimes is enlightening for you. Plus, sometimes you do need to physically rest your hands just to be able to sustain a long practice. All right. Nervous Rack asks, what is a tenuto? It seems like there is more than one definition, like holding a note for its full length or playing louder, but are notes normally held for their full duration anyway? Boy, that's a great question. And, The answer to this is to a great extent context, but yes, tenuto is holding notes long. Now sometimes that will actually be somewhat disconnected in order to get the sense of each note being long compared to a slur, because you might wonder, why write tenuto on each note when you can have a slur telling you to connect everything? And the whole idea is to make these notes long and to be able to, like if I were to play 3 notes slurred, I would think of playing them like this. And as I discussed in previous seminars with you, the idea of slurring on a piano is not truly a slur which has the notes between the notes if you are singing it or playing it on many wind instruments or even bowed instruments. On the piano, what we do is you overlap the notes slightly to get that legato effect. Now tenuto, depending upon the context, because it depends upon where it is in the music, might be something more along these lines. Did you hear how each note was separate but long? So that's the idea of tenuto that composers are trying to impart. It's very difficult, obviously, with words and markings to communicate the sound that they're after, and that's what interpretation is all about. Being able to get inside the piece of music and understand it from a deep level. And interestingly, it's not always what the composer intended. And you might think that's heresy for me to even say that. But think about this. If you listen to some great pianists or musicians of any ilk, if you hear them play the same piece on more than one performance, they don't play it the same each time. So, do you think Beethoven played his Moonlight Sonata the same every time? It depends what mood he was in. So the whole idea is to make the music part of you, to make it a living, breathing thing, just like an actor or actress will take a role and become that part. And no 2 actors are going to approach a role the same way. So it is with performing on the piano. All right, Major and Minor asks, what are some tips on sight reading quicker when there's a difficult key signature and some difficult polyrhythms? Well, there's 2 different aspects here. Difficult key signatures assumes that some keys are harder than others. And in reality, no keys are any more difficult than any other keys once you master your key signatures and get comfortable playing in different keys. How do you do that? Well, I talked at the very beginning about number 1, developing your technique. Learn all your major and minor scales and arpeggios. It's a very, very good thing to do for your technique. Plus, it gives you a sense of the music and the understanding of keys. The other thing you could do is take a simple chord progression like 1, 4, 1, 6, 4, 5, 7, 1. For those of you who don't know what that means, I'll play it for you. And you'll go, oh yeah, I've heard that. It's kind of establishing the key. So in C major, it would sound like this. If you got equally comfortable playing that chord progression in all keys, then no key is particularly different. Now you might think, well, what about other notes or chords or harmonies? Well, once you get comfortable with a basic chord progression like this, you can one by one add different chords. For example, start with the 1, 4 and then add a 2, 6 for this. Then you might turn that into a 1, 5, 7 of 5. That is a D7 going to the 5, the 1, 6, 4, 5, 7, 1. Well, listen to it. You'll understand what I'm saying. Now, these are just some ideas. It doesn't have to be these specific chord progressions. As a matter of fact, if you have a simple song you play that you like, try to challenge yourself. Let's say you play it in C major all the time. Try it in G major, then in D major. Start familiarizing yourself with many different keys, and you will there won't be such a thing as a difficult key signature. They're all about the same, ultimately. Polyrhythms, that's a whole other issue. Depends what the polyrhythm is. If it's one you've never seen before, like a 22 against 7, obviously you're going to have to figure that one out. But there are certain polyrhythms you're going to find again and again and again, like 3 against 2, 3 against 4 are two classic examples. And there are ways in which you can practice polyrhythms by either tapping them out or even playing different keys on the piano, like a 3 against 2. Like, let's say I played C, D, E in the right hand and C, G in the left hand, triplets in the right hand against duplets in the left hand, 3 in the right hand against 2 in the left hand. And then you can reverse the hands. So that's just a 3 against 2. So if you have a mastery over several polyrhythms, challenge yourself with 3 against 5 and all sorts of polyrhythms. Now, if it's a new one you haven't ever seen before, you're going to have to spend a little time with it. There's no shortcut for figuring out polyrhythms. You know, because some of them don't have, like a 3 against 4. There is no simple way of describing that. You just have to listen to it. And one great way to listen to it is to play one hand silently on the top of the piano, listening. The 4 you can hear in there very easily. So playing that silently on top of the piano, you can hear the triplet and the integrity of the evenness of the triplet. Pretty close. So that's a way you can hear when there's discrepancies in your rhythm, by playing one hand silently and the other hand, and you can reverse them, making sure both hands are even. Great way to work on polyrhythms, by the way. All right. Yeah, we have another one. Second question. How much different is rubato from regular rhythm? Oh, rubato is not altering the rhythm exactly. It's simply a give and take, where you ever like ride in a car and you go up a hill and down again and you get that feeling of when you're going over the crest of the hill. Rubato is kind of like that, rushing to the middle of the phrase and then holding back towards the end of the phrase. And so in certain period styles, it really is inappropriate because the music wasn't written to be played that way. If you played Mozart, for example, with rubato, it would sound like this, you know? Now, when I just play that one little phrase, you might think, that sounds okay to me. And you know, one little phrase does. But if you were to hear the whole movement like that, it would kind of make you seasick. Listen to it the proper way without rubato. Now, in the Romantic era, with composers like Liszt and Chopin and Mendelssohn, not using rubato is out of character. I'm going to play the beginning of the B-flat minor nocturne with no rubato, which is going to be a challenge, I got to tell you, but I'm going to give it a go. It's lacking soul. Listen to it with rubato. And the secret to rubato is that you can tap along. It's never an abrupt change. And I'll demonstrate that in a moment. But first, listen to it with rubato. Just that first phrase of Chopin's B-flat minor nocturne. It makes a world of difference there, doesn't it? So how do you know if you're doing too much rubato? Well, for one thing, you should never gain or lose time. It's pulling ahead a little bit and then catching up. So you never actually gain time or lose time. The other thing that is vital for rubato to be effective is that it should never be a sudden change. For example, all of you out there, I'm going to start clapping my hands, and I want you to clap along with me. Do the best you can to try to clap along with me. Here we go. Now you're probably going, what's wrong with this? Yeah, it's impossible because it's not even. Rubato, even though it gets faster and slower, you're going to be able to keep right up with me. Here we go. This is how rubato works. The speeding up, the slowing down, the pulse is always maintained in a rubato. That's the secret to rubato. Sabella Ruby asks, Mr. Robert, any recommendations on how to balance work and music? I just finished my engineering degree, and in university, managing piano practice was doable, and now not so much. You know, this is a huge challenge. Now, here's the key for everyone out there, and I bet you all feel this way. I don't care if you're a professional musician, you're a major in, somebody majoring in piano performance. There's always work that gets in the way of your piano practice. This is a fact of life. And how do you balance it? Well, obviously you have to eat, you have to sleep, and you have to be able to survive in this world. You know, one secret is whenever you have any time to practice, take advantage of it. You know, you might only have 10 minutes, dinner is almost ready. Oh, it's only 10 minutes. You think, oh, I'll just read my phone. No, get to the piano, put 10 minutes in. 10 minutes is way better than no time at all. You can really gain a lot if every time you have any free spare time, you put it to some piano practice. The other thing is, you might set aside, say, I'm going to practice an hour every day, or 30 minutes every day, or 2 hours whatever it is. It doesn't even matter. But when you have a good day and things are going well for you, take the time to spend more time when it's good. And you know what? Conversely, if you have a day where just nothing is happening and you're beating yourself up and you're not accomplishing anything, your mind is not into it, do something else. Maybe you can find something valuable you can do at the piano, like sight reading new material, or playing just improvisations for fun, or, playing some old pieces that you haven't played in a while, just so you can enjoy sitting at the piano, not being maybe highly productive in the way that you thought you would be, but at least you're doing something, keeping your fingers moving, refreshing old music, reading something new. Otherwise, do something else, because then when you are into it, you sit down, you'll get a tremendous amount out of it. And Jay asked, what is a marcato? Second question, how to memorize more complex fugues like 4-part fugues and 5-part fugues of the well-tempered clavier. Marcato, I'm kind of stumped here. I hate to say it. Anybody here? James? Isn't it like a detached kind of thing?
Yeah, very marked notes.
So each note is delineated from each other note. I kind of figured that, but I just wanted another opinion, so we have our engineer and musician, James Hilserbeck, helping us out with this here. And the second question, memorizing fugues with 3 or 4 parts is really a huge challenge. And I'll tell you why. The way I was taught to memorize and the way I've taught many, many people over the years, the way my father taught probably thousands of people, and many of his students have gone on teaching many people, and my sister who's taught countless people how to memorize is taking hands separately and memorizing a small part at a time, putting them together, going on to the next section, connecting sections as you go. Here's the problem when you have counterpoint, complex counterpoint with 3, 4, or 5 voices. The voices go between the hands. So it's really hard to be able to figure out what you're doing hands separately. It doesn't even make any sense. And there's a lot of music that works that way in the piano, where if you play the hands separately, it doesn't make sense. So what do? Well, there's a lot of things. First of all, you still can learn hands separately just to break it down in some metric. Then what you must do is follow through each of the inner lines. Just as I talked about earlier, playing some legato, if there's an inner line that divides between the hands, just play that inner line, dividing it between the hands as you see fit. One of the biggest challenges of learning complex writing like fugues, where you have all these separate lines intertwining, is how to divide the hands. So one essential part of your practice is figuring that out as you learn each phrase. Nervous Wreck is back again. Why does the art of arrangement and improvisation take a backseat compared to interpretation and music education today, even though the great musicians of the past were expected to be creators? Arrangement and improvisation take a backseat to interpretation. Well, interpretation, you're talking about taking music of other composers and bringing it to life. And you're saying that arranging and improvising are not as respected. Well, arranging is actually a very big field. Transcriptions in the classical world and remixes now in modern, more popular-oriented music is a big deal. So I think that is somewhat respected. As far as improvising in the classical world is kind of like not a thing anymore. It's very rare that people do it. I mean, I do it all the time, and I love to do it, and I know others who are very, very skilled at it. And it's interesting to note that nearly all the great composers were also improvisers. I mean, Mozart, Chopin, Liszt, many of the writings, the more fantasies of Chopin and the rhapsodies of Liszt, they have this sense of improvisatory writing where we get a glimpse of what they improvised, because of course there was no recording around. And I think it's a sad fact that everybody's just playing the sheet music, everybody's playing the same music to a great extent, by the way, and everybody is hearing everybody and sounding more and more like the same as one another. And I predict that in the future, things are going to shift in the ways that you just mentioned. I think improvisation will become a bigger force in classical music because, after all, things go in cycles. For example, Baroque music at one time was always done on modern instruments, and even, some Bach pieces were played by full symphony orchestras. Then people started to get wise to the fact that, hey, let's do this for the original instrumentation. We don't need a symphony orchestra to play a Brandenburg concerto, do we? And the answer is no, you don't. And really, it sounds better with the original instruments. Then some people even use the actual original instruments, the different bows on the stringed instruments, for even more authenticity. So just as that came back and the harpsichord was resurrected in the 20th century, Wanda Landowska had a big part of that, although her harpsichord was very, very altered from the harpsichords of the era when it was a popular musical instrument. At least it brought attention back to this instrument. So too may improvisation in the classical world become more of a thing. And I'm hoping that people will learn that, hey, being able to interpret very much like what everybody else is used to hearing, while it's valuable and a very important skill to learn as a student, being able to explore radically different interpretations like the pianists from the past, from Glenn Gould to Vladimir Horowitz, and so many pianists and other musicians from the early 20th century, I'd like to see that to make a resurgence. And I wonder how many of you out there feel the same way and have a real passion for the old performers, Rachmaninoff, Hoffman, Levine, and more. So great questions. We've got another one from Ech4949. I like the question about taking a break. Do you recommend having a day off from the piano each week? Well, no. I mean, my schedule's so busy that sometimes it's unavoidable for me. I don't take a day completely off from piano, but days in which I can practice as much as I want are few and far between these days. Running the business, making videos, all the rest of it. It's always a challenge, which brings us back to that earlier question. So as far as taking a day off, if you want to take a day off, on the piano, it's not a deal breaker. Now, I'm also a French hornist, that's easy for me to say. My wife is a flutist. And on wind instruments, taking a day off just isn't worth it because the musculature of the embouchure is such that taking a day, even one day off, when you come back to it, you got to work harder to get everything back in position. One day off on the piano, I don't find to do very much damage. And if you like a day off, it's not going to hurt you. but it's certainly by no means necessary in any way, shape, or form, unless you feel it's necessary for you, psychically or physically. And Scrappy Bob Barker, how do I develop playing one hand louder than the other? This is a great question. And one of the ways in which you can do this is simply lean more weight in one, make one arm heavier than the other. One arm make lighter. And indeed, that is the secret to playing one hand louder than the other, is simply playing with arm weight. I've talked about the importance of playing with arm weight. As a matter of fact, I have a video that has not been released yet on this very subject you're going to want to watch, because what do I mean by playing with arm weight? And I'll describe it briefly because I have a video that's coming out on this subject, but as a little preview, you notice when I played a little bit of the B-flat minor nocturne, particularly with the rubato, there was a smoothness to the expression. And the way to get a smooth line is by leaning the weight of the arm. And as you play louder, you lean more weight. And when you play softer, you lean less weight. But it's not like you play the key and then you limp up and have no weight. No, the entire time you're playing the key, in slow playing that is, fast playing, this is not something you want to try to do because it's impossible. But with slow playing, in order to get a smooth connection from note to note where they're going to be the same volume, you simply, right now as I'm playing on my arm, I can feel the weight of this finger because I'm kind of supporting my arm weight with this finger. And then if I transfer it to the next finger, it's kind of exactly the same weight. Doing that on the piano. Each note is exactly the same weight, so they're going to be the same volume. So by playing one hand with more weight and the other hand with less weight, you're going to be able to hear the difference in volume between your two hands. It's the best way to develop that. Okay, now Major and Minor ask, what are some tips to play lighter, fluttery, and more rapid scales? I'm having some trouble making them sound effortless. I'm learning Mendelssohn's Warsaw Concerto and have some rapid sections. Well, once again, practicing, zeroing in on the sections that you need to get up to speed with lightness and control and that fluttery sound you're describing. Conversely, or it might not be intuitive to think that practicing slowly is the answer, but try putting your metronome on and playing very slowly and go through the section, and just doing that a few times at an undertempo will already help. But then if you want to really refine further, take just a small section of what's really the most difficult part and go one notch at a time in your metronome. Now, if you have an app like is so common today, if it goes one number to the next, that's a little not enough. Typically, notches on an old school metronome would go from 60 to 63, into 66, 69, and of course, if it's doubled, it would be double that, 120, 126, and things of that nature. So do one or two notches at a time, and you'll develop a fluency. The other thing, in general, the faster you play, as I mentioned, the lighter you must play in order to be able to facilitate fast playing. Because you can't support a lot of arm weight when playing fast because your fingers don't have the strength. So lighten up, practice with the metronome, do metronome speeds, and get your foot off the pedal when you're practicing. The pedal is literally the last thing to add, the icing on the cake. You want to hear what you're doing. And the only way to hear clearly is to practice primarily without using the pedal. Slow metronome work, metronome speeds a notch or two at a time, without the pedal, and that could be a great way to help to develop the speed that you're looking for in the Warsaw Concerto. Bijan asks, how do you suggest getting started with using the pedal? Well, to use the pedal when you're starting the piano, it's really essential that you have a teacher marking in exactly where the pedal goes down and where the pedal goes up, either with bars or with PED period where it goes down and little stars where it comes up. Students must be told specifically in a piece of music where each time the pedal goes down and each time it goes up. There is no substitute for training in that regard. If you're on your own trying to figure out where to pedal, remember this: the pedal goes down after you play notes and comes up exactly when you play the next notes. So, for example, I'm going to play a C major triad, and I'm going to lift my hand completely off, and then I'm going to play a D minor triad. And I'm going to tell you when since you can't see my feet on this, maybe next time we'll have a third camera for you, but I'm going to tell you when I put my pedal down. Pedal down. Pedal up. Pedal down. Now I'm going to do exactly the same thing without talking so you can hear how completely smooth it is. Now you might wonder, why can't you just pedal on the note? If you do that, you'll always get the previous harmonies. I'm going to play those two chords now, and I'm going to put the pedal down exactly when I play the C major chord and exactly when I play the D minor chord. And you're going to hear the C major chord melding into the D minor chord, giving you this dissonance that you're probably not after. It's so hard for me to pedal wrong that I didn't do a good job of pedaling exactly on the D minor. Let me try it again. That was better at being bad. You know, it's so ingrained. My foot has a mind of its own. It pedals automatically. And yours will too. If you practice always putting the pedal down after you play the note or notes that you want sustained and lift them up exactly when you play the next notes. All right, so that's the secret. And the second question, I can't get as loud a sound, particularly when accenting in right hand with pinky as my professor. He's physically bigger, but that shouldn't affect it, right? How can I get loud sound without it sounding harsh? You know, there is no substitute for developing strength. Assuming you're in a good position, your pinky is rounded, you're over the keys where you should be, there's only so much strength your pinky might have. And practicing and developing more strength is a great way to be able to project the sound of your pinky. Now, if you're playing chords or any music that has more than one note in the right hand, let's say, and you want to bring out that right hand pinky, leaning the weight more towards that side of the hand, so you kind of lean this way, can help you to get more projection out of the pinky than the thumb, which is naturally stronger and heavier. And the sense of reaching with your pinky, which I've talked about before, so you can get more strength out of it. So if I played a chord like this, and I'm going to do just the leaning technique first. Now I'm going to do just the reaching technique. The reaching would seem to be more extreme. If I did both, then you get a real sense. If I played that same chord without doing the reaching and the leaning, you'd have a more balanced sound of the three notes. And in fact, it's not all that balanced. The thumb is so big and heavy that G really pumps out, doesn't it? Unless you intentionally make the effort to reach for that E and put the weight more towards the right side of your right hand. And that's the secret to getting more sound out of the pinky. That and, months or years of practice to develop more strength and finger independence, which can take some people years to develop. It took me a very, very long time to develop strength, and my pinkies and all my fingers would collapse. I couldn't even reach an octave very solidly when I was 13 years old. I had very small hands and always struggled to develop strength. But the good news is, if you stay with it, and if you can reach an octave, boy, that really makes a difference. If you can reach a solid octave, as I certainly can now. That along with spending a lot of time with the instrument and work on hard music, maybe music that you can't necessarily master, but just to practice it so that you can develop the strength and later be able to get a piece on performance level that might be above you now. Just a Man asks, any tips on developing fluidity with trills, turns, etc. with fingers 4 and 5? Well, here again, it's developing that independence and strength of the 4th and 5th finger. You probably noticed if you put all your fingers down and try to lift up the 4th finger, it's really hard. It doesn't want to work independently. Now, what can you do to develop the 4th and 5th finger for trills? Well, you could spend some time with it, but one thing that sometimes can help you to just realize where the notes have to occur within the beat is to play just one note of a trill. So let's say you had a 4/5 trill. Something like of that nature. If you just play the C's and then the B's, believe it or not, that could be a really good way to get the sense of each note of the trill, particularly if you're playing it with another part. That's a hard trill, by the way. And you try to avoid those trills whenever possible. If there's another fingering you can use, 4 and 5 trill is very, very tough. Sometimes there's no choice when you have other notes that are being held down. You have to resort to 4 and 5 fingers for trills. But for the most part, do your best to use strong trill fingers. 3 and 1 is a great trill finger. 2 and 4 isn't bad. 3 and 2, of course. And then it gets harder when you're utilizing the 4th and 5th fingers. And Russ D asks, how do you source cadenzas for Mozart piano concertos without existing cadenzas from Mozart or later composers like Beethoven? What cadenzas to choose for Mozart is a tough one. And sometimes, even if Beethoven has written a cadenza for a concerto like his cadenza for the the orchestra part to his 466, K466 D minor concerto. The cadenza that Beethoven wrote in that is a brilliant little piece of music, but it's like suddenly in the middle of this Mozart concerto, you're in another era, another style, another personality. It doesn't sound anything like Mozart. So you might even choose a different cadenza for a concerto, even if there is a great one. It's a matter of finding one that you like. Now, many times, musicians, performers, they like to show off in cadenzas, and they'll pick a crazy cadenza just to show what they can do that has no bearing on the piece of music. So it's like you suddenly in the middle of this concerto, you have a 20th century piece of music in a classical era concerto. It's like, what are you doing? So I'm a believer in trying to, make the piece work as a whole and find something that's stylistically as close as possible and something you like. And more than that, choose a cadenza that you can play on a high level. Don't think just because there is a cadenza that some people play that's really hard, that's too hard for you, that's harder than the entire concerto, that you have to play that cadenza. You don't. Now the only exception to that would be if the composer themselves wrote the cadenza to the concerto you're playing. Yeah, you should play what the composer wrote. But if they didn't write one anyway, find something that suits you. And while you might want to show off in a cadenza that has no bearing on the music of the piece, personally, I like cadenzas that are stylistically integral to the composition. Republic Cooper, any tips for playing glissandi? I'm thinking of 3 movements from Petrushka Stravinsky. Okay, in a nutshell, the secret to playing glissandi is the angle of your hand, so that you're playing glissandi always with your fingernails. If you try playing glissandi and you're using your fingers, you're going to tear them up. It's very painful, particularly on the black keys. But if you use your fingernails, even black key glissandi are not hard, and white keys are a piece of cake. And the other thing is ending glissandis are very, very important. And I think of the Marx Brothers. If you've ever watched, there's some really classic, and they're hysterically funny, with Harpo and Zeppo. And one of the things you'll see is, it's a funny thing that he does with his hands. He goes, he does it in such a way, it's almost like he's using a gun at the last note. It's very visually funny to watch him do it. But you can learn something from it, because indeed, ending your glissandi with a precise termination with a finger is one of the most important parts. Just like ending trills is really the hardest part about trills, so with glissandi also. You can either use a single finger or you can use your whole hand if you need a lot of power. Like 3 fingers going on the final note of the glissando. So that's the secret to it. And glissandos can be played going the opposite direction by using your thumbnail. And make sure you use your nails in your glissandi. And if you get the angle just right, it's effortless. All right. We have one last question for you, and I want to thank everybody for joining me. And go to livingpianos.com, suggestions for future videos. We've making these all the time. We've been doing it for 10 years, and there's well over 1,000 videos for you. And you can search them by keywords at livingpianos.com. And if I'm missing any, let me know, because I always like new subjects for you. The last question is, how do I practice everything I need to every day? I need to do scales, arpeggios, hand in my songs, and what will help me learn more effectively? I sometimes describe an effective practice session as almost like a fine meal with different courses. So you might start with an appetizer of scales and arpeggios to warm up, and then maybe go straight to memorization, because it's the hardest thing. You want to tackle it when your mind is fresh. Then go back to what you worked on the day before, solidifying everything you've done. And moving on now, you're not going to have time to do everything you want to do every day, but it's not essential to do everything every day. But you can certainly touch on everything every day if you like. Some things should be practiced every day. For example, if you're memorizing a new piece of music, skipping days is really counterproductive because you're going to take 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. But if you at least solidify the work you do each day and push ahead at least a little bit, that's the best way to tackle a piece of music while your mind is fresh, taking advantage of being able to learn parts easily while you haven't exhausted your brain with a bunch of memorization. Memorizing for 2 hours at a time is really hard. So memorize for 20 minutes here, do some scales for 10 minutes, do some sight reading, do some review pieces, and you can sustain a very productive practice. Well, I really appreciate all of you joining me here today, and there'll be many, many more videos coming. And like I say, I welcome the suggestions. And again, I'm Robert Estrin here at livingpianos.com, your online piano store.